Hey there, viewers. You guys are tuned in to the first collaboration podcast between myself, Rhetorical Pixel, or, call me Eric, whatever pleases you, and my partner over here.
Blonde to the Bone, or you can call me Maddie.
Right.
This is our first podcast, and we will be looking at a video by In Q. It is a spoken word poem about gun control, and we're going to share a little bit about what we think.
Yeah, so sort of our goal with this podcast right now is to sort of dive into what he says, the message he's kind of portraying, and sort of give you an alternate viewpoint, maybe fill you guys into something that maybe you haven't heard. If stuff like his is kind of the only stuff you've heard, then maybe this will be news to you. If it's not, then I don't know, hopefully we can shed some light or maybe bolster your arguments if you kind of agree with us already. So to begin with here, we're just going to dive right in, and this podcast is kind of formatted in mostly assuming that you watch the original before you listen to our podcast. So in the description below, we'll put a link to the original. Please, please, please go take a look at that video first. Just inform yourself about what this guy says and just, be aware. And we're going to move forward with this podcast just talking about some stuff. There will be some clips of anything important, and so you won't be completely hung out to dry. We'll try and get you some context when we feel it's most important. But right now we're going to dive right in and start by playing you the first clip that we want to show you. This is sort of when he talks about some statistics and stuff. So have a listen, and then we'll come back.
Private guns have killed more Americans since 1960 than all of our wars combined. Now, personally, that's a statistic that completely blows my mind. Or what about the number of our gun-related homicides? It's higher than any other developed country by 20 times. And that's not only crimes, because on the average, roughly 33,000 people every year lose their lives.
So now we're going to start talking about some of the things that he says, and we're going to provide some facts and some arguments and all that sweet, good stuff. So first thing we'd like to start with is his claim that private guns have killed more Americans since 1960 than all of our wars combined. Now, the main issue that we're going to be diving into here is the word killed. It's a really crucial word. That can include just flat gun deaths and homicides. So that's a really crucial distinction there that we want to point out, because the gun death number is a lot higher than the gun homicide number. And when you combine them, it's overall much higher. Obviously, you're combining them. So our first sort of statistic we're going to pull out here is from the Department of Veteran Affairs and the CDC. So this was sort of a combined study. Some information was kind of put together. And, the issue with looking at the concept that private guns have killed more Americans than all of our wars, you're just looking at a number. It's not a percentage, it's not a ratio, it's not anything like that. So while he may throw this claim out there at the beginning of the video and it sounds, super impactful, wow, it's just a number. I mean, as time goes on, our gun deaths will most certainly continue to exceed the number of deaths in our wars. And I mean, assuming we don't have any more major wars with massive casualties, this number is going to grow continuously over the decades, and it's going to continue to get higher, and who knows? I mean, over time, it'll eventually maybe be double than all of our wars combined. But the key there is that it's just a flat number. It's not a percentage. It doesn't give you an idea of how bad or how good or whatever the situation is of guns in America and any deaths tied to that. So that's sort of our first issue with what he mentions.
We see a lot of his his generalized facts that we have fact checked. So you're going to see that as a trend moving forward. Our next point that we pulled out was the number of our gun-related homicides is higher than any other developed country by 20 times. There are some issues with this line that he has. First of all, what defines a developed country? What is he considering developed? I mean, Eric, you said before, like, is he considering Greece a developed country or not? Is that a country that would change the statistics? Yeah, it would. It would change it dramatically. It would almost make his fact seem completely obsolete.
Yeah, I mean, there's a major issue, and as you'll see as we move on, with defining terms, what's included, what isn't included. I mean, the term developed country, it's kind of subjective. And I mean, even if you lay out terms that define what a developed country is, well, how do you know you're not excluding something? And I mean, as you'll see, that term developed country comes into play, and it kind of has a significant impact, because what they deem a developed country turns out to have less gun deaths than other countries that have access to firearms, But, I mean, continue.
Yeah, well, another thing that is important to consider, because he's talking about the United States in this. He is American. He's bringing up statistics that are solely based on the United States. One thing that you need to factor in is gang violence. 90% of gang-related homicides involve guns, and that fact was pulled from the CDC, along with 80% of gun homicides are gang-related. Now, it brings up another issue entirely. Eric, do you know any gangs that abide by the law?
Yeah, that's kind of the issue. I mean, you kind of have to tie that with crime for the vast majority of the time you hear that word.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that is being pulled into consideration. I know that there are gangs in other countries. There are. I'm not saying that there aren't. But gang violence is a particularly strong issue in the United States, and obviously accounts for a lot of gun-related homicides. And while we are a developed country, we are a developed country that has a lot of gang violence, and that's just something that we need to factor into statistics when we bring them up.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to that sort of developed country point, the U.S., when you look at on a global scale of just all countries entirely in terms of their gun-related deaths or homicides, particularly looking at this, the U.S. has less firearm deaths and murders on a global scale than a lot of other countries. But when you look at that developed country sort of aspect of it, you're missing out on a big perspective that's kind of important. I mean, in particular, South America, at least just looking from some of these maps and stuff that we've researched, South America's got a huge gun homicide problem. But I mean, again, you can also tie that to sort of drug cartel stuff. But it's important that you don't exclude random countries just because, I don't know, maybe it suits your narrative to do so. I find that problematic. And I mean, for someone who doesn't have the time to sit there and Google all these statistics and roll through it like we have, it can be kind of damaging to someone's perspective on these issues. It can really disrupt any sort of ability to achieve a consensus or a solution or anything like that when partial facts are given or facts are manipulated for the sake of making someone's argument a little bit better.
Yeah, and the USA has the most guns. Yes, we do. We have the Second Amendment that a lot of people embrace and are proud of. So on average, we have about 88 per 100. The United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime and Small Army Survey of 2007 also told us that the USA is not highest on gun murder rate, though. We are only number 28.
Yeah, that's really, really crucial, too, because a lot of people say, oh, America has so many guns. Why do we need all these? Well, I mean, we have a ton of guns, but then you look at that statistic and we're not highest on the gun murder rate. It's kind of significant. And I mean, that kind of speaks to gun ownership versus gun crime. Are those things really related?
Yeah, I don't think that there is a positive correlation. In the research we've done, we haven't seen a correlation between the number of people who own guns and the amount of crimes that are committed with guns.
All right, so now we're final sort of statistical thing, I guess you could say. This guy's not big on statistics, but he does bring a few into it at the beginning. This is his third and kind of final statistic he brings in, and he says, and that's not only crimes, because on the average, roughly 33,000 people every year lose their lives. Well, he's sort of referencing what we were talking about before with the murder versus death conundrum. He mentions here that 33,000 people every year lose their lives, which does include other things like accidents, suicides, and it does include homicides. So this is a total number. And that's sort of another issue that you need to consider and think about and make up your mind on, is suicide and accidental firearm deaths. Should we lump those in with homicides? I would say no, because I think homicides are a violent problem. They're a violent issue. Suicide is sort of, while it may be committed with a firearm, it's a different sort of problem that we need to look at and address. Now, this again comes from another CDC study. 63% of the 33,636, to be precise, 63% of those deaths are suicides. So looking at that figure, you can see why we have some concern with people lumping in gun deaths into their total numbers that they throw around. I mean, you can see that 63%. That's a big chunk of 33,000.
Yeah, and not to belittle the fact that 63% of those deaths are suicides, but to bring attention to the fact that gun control, while it's a good argument to make, and it sounds good, it's not necessarily true. And I think that he kind of took advantage of the fact that 33,000 people every year lose their lives. I think that he really played that to his advantage, and it was almost insulting to the fact that he blew over the issue of mental health, and bring up that, do a spoken word on that, bring in an important issue. If you have a problem with how many people are dying, look at the statistics. A big chunk of that is from suicides.
Right. And I mean, that's a common discussion too. A lot of people say, if people kill themselves with a firearm, then that's a firearm issue. And then other people say, well, no, that's a mental health issue. That's a suicide issue in and of itself. And I mean, at least my stance on this is, the tool that someone uses to commit suicide isn't necessarily the problem. We need to see why someone wanted to go down that road in the first place. And I mean, I think a lot of these things can be analyzed and addressed. And before we go necessarily looking at firearms as an issue, which is a fundamental right given to all people in the United States, all citizens in the United States, Second Amendment, it's worked into our Constitution. It is a fundamental right. Before we go messing around with that, maybe, just maybe, we should dive into the mental health end and take a closer look at that to see if there aren't avenues we haven't exhausted already.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much that we need to do and that we need to move forward in regarding mental health and what we offer people who are struggling. I think that is an issue that's really underdeveloped and not getting the attention that it needs, especially when it's lumped in to statistics to support claims such as we need gun control.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of wraps up what he views as his statistical inclusions there. But, I mean, as you've heard, it's a lot more complex than he sort of makes it seem. So we kind of just wanted to do you the service of digging a little deeper and giving you a little more insight on the facts and the nuances of that. So, now that you're armed with those facts, I mean, we have our stance, but, we're not trying to be, unclear about that. We have our stance, but we want to provide you with the facts so that you guys can make up your own minds. You viewers can just take a look at this, hear these numbers, and if what we say doesn't convince you, that's fine. At least you have the information now, and you can make a complete argument then, at least a lot more complete of an argument than he makes.
The next thing we're going to take a look at is when he says people are hiding behind the Second Amendment. This is interesting to me because he's not bringing in a statistic. He's just attacking character. He's insulting people who have a different view than him and calling them cowardly or unfeeling. And this is interesting because it brings the question up, is he hiding behind the First Amendment when he makes this video? Is he hiding behind the fact that he has the right to say what he wants? You know, I don't think that people who practice the Second Amendment are hiding behind anything. I think that people who practice the Second Amendment are honestly brave.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just him either. I've seen this happen in other sources and stuff like that. They'll say, you know, people who value the Second Amendment are using it as a crutch to stand on, or they're using it as a shield to try and protect their own selfish desires or something like that. I agree with you on that sentiment that, you know, people who practice the Second Amendment, who own a firearm or carry a firearm or anything like that, that's an enormous responsibility. I mean, you know, we all acknowledge here, firearms are a serious thing. They're not a toy. And if you are willing to carry one of those for your own safety or the safety of those around you, as we have seen but is often underreported in the news when firearms are used to save people, I think that's a great responsibility that you're taking on. And you're taking your life and your safety into your own hands by doing that. And to say that people are hiding behind the Second Amendment, I think is just a gross understatement of what people are doing with the Second Amendment. And it's insulting, it's inflammatory to call someone cowardly or unfeeling like that. You know, and it comes from different angles too. They say you're cowardly because you just say the Second Amendment is written there, and, you know, it's implying you don't have a real reason to continue owning a firearm. It's saying that you're just falling in line with what's written in the Constitution because you just want to have access to what you have. Well, again, we brought that up, responsibility, all that sort of thing. It's a lot deeper than that surface insult. And then the unfeeling aspect comes from when a mass shooting occurs. And if you don't fall in line with some random YouTuber poet's prescriptions, which to be honest, he doesn't even really prescribe any solutions and throughout this entire poem, which is ridiculous. But if you don't fall in line with their prescriptions for what needs to be done immediately after a mass shooting occurs, that you're considered unfeeling. How do you know that?
Exactly. And the Second Amendment, you know, it's there for a reason, and it was created for a reason. And if you take away that right for the people to have guns, to own guns, then you're demilitarizing them. Then the only people who have guns are military and criminals.
Yeah. And, you know, like you said, it has a purpose. And I mean, a lot of people like to say hunting and this other stuff. Well, no. You can use firearms for those things, and that's fine. We fully support that. But the core reason the Second Amendment exists is for one's own right for self-preservation, whether that's from a criminal, whether that's from any danger that's coming at you in which a firearm can help defend yourself, tyranny, either internal or external. I mean, many people say that all the time, you know, and people say you're crazy if you think you might have to defend yourself from our own government. And I'm not saying we're there. This isn't, you know, doomsday podcast, you know, we're not trying to do that. But I mean, the possibility is there. You can't deny that the fact that the possibility is there. We're not saying it's now, but it's there. And it also means that we are armed and capable should we have an international threat. Should anything come to our front door, we've got a lot of people, a lot of citizens in this country that are equipped to deal with the solution, which makes us a little bit more formidable in that aspect. All right, so a little further down the line, he says he's been accused of wanting to take people's guns away, but that he really doesn't want to take anyone's guns away. This is kind of a tricky thing to navigate here, and you're just going to have to bear with us on this one because it's a little rough to navigate, but you'll probably see what we mean once we talk about it. So the reason that people say this, or they may say this about him, is because commonly proposed gun legislation wouldn't actually prevent mass shootings from occurring. So if he's on the side of proposing more gun legislation, more restrictions on firearms, a lot of people say those restrictions wouldn't prevent mass shootings from happening. And the only way that it may fix anything is if we have a full-scale gun ban or gun confiscation. That's the only way we may see any sort of impact. But the issue with that is, again, you're crossing way into the line of removing someone's fundamental rights that were granted in the Constitution. But even that wouldn't work because mass murderers typically aren't really known for caring about the law. So writing in a law in this country that says firearms are illegal completely, does anyone realistically think that's going to prevent someone from obtaining a firearm and doing what they want to do with it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you take away the right to bear arms, where does it stop? Where is the government going to stop in terms of the things that they're going to take away? What amendment is next? If the Second Amendment's first, well, are we going to lose our right to vote? Are women going to lose the right to vote?
Yeah, it starts crossing into that line, and I know people will say this is a slippery slope fallacy, whatever you want to call it. I mean, personally, I think that calling that a fallacy is a little silly. Like, sometimes slippery slopes can be slippery slopes, but other times you need to look at the ramifications of setting a precedent. And removing a fundamental right from Americans would be extremely dangerous because that opens the door for people farther down the line, way farther in the future when we've forgotten about it, to say, well, look back then, we made restrictions on the Second Amendment. Therefore, First Amendment, any other amendment to the Constitution is also up for debate. And that's personally somewhere I would not like to see us go. And just to sort of reinforce what we were saying, there's a Gallup poll that asked people whether they thought tighter gun control would stop mass shootings. 42%. This is a random poll, random people. This wasn't pulled from gun supporters, wasn't pulled from gun control advocates. 42% of people felt that tighter gun control would not have any effect on the incidence of mass shootings in the country. 42%. That's a fairly large number of our population that feels tighter gun control wouldn't necessarily do anything. And I think it's significant that we recognize that large portion of the population.
The next thing he brings up is about Congress and how they won't do their jobs, quotes around do their jobs. Congress's job is to represent the people. Now, whether or not he wants to believe it, a large portion of the population is not in favor of gun control. Therefore, by not enacting anything to do or any kind of control or new law, Congress is doing its job. Congress is there for the people. And unless everyone was in agreement, Congress is doing exactly what it is meant to be doing. It's representing the people in the best way they can.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of reminds me of, what our country actually is. A lot of people call it a democracy. Not true. It's not a full democracy. It's a democratic republic. That's really crucial here because the republic part of that means that we have representatives. So while we do vote on things, we don't take every person's vote into account for every little thing that happens in the country. I mean, we're way too large for that. But yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Their job is to represent us. And if a lot of people don't feel that more gun control should be enacted, that is their job. Their job isn't to do what this guy wants them to do. It's not for them to do what some other person wants them to do. Their job is to listen to the people and do the things that they feel represent the people's interests. Now, we're going to bring in some more stuff from the Gallup poll that we mentioned earlier. So this, again, asking random people what they feel about random topics related to gun control. So first thing is 60% of Americans want the sale of firearms to be more strict. with 33% of people wanting it to be kept as it is now. So this is an interesting statistic. 60% of people want the sale of firearms. It's crucial, sale. They don't necessarily want regulations on how you own them, on where they can be carried, how they're stored, what types of firearms can be sold, necessarily what parts can be on a firearm, how large a magazine can be. That stuff isn't mentioned. So 60% of people want the sale, the act of it being sold, to be more strict. But even then, 33% of people want it to be kept as it is now. And I'm sure the other, whatever it is, 7% or such, didn't really have an opinion, or they were kind of like lightly leaning in one direction. So you're looking at probably somewhere close to 40% of people who aren't necessarily jumping the gun and saying the sale of firearms needs to be more strict. But again, we're talking about the sale of firearms, which that's a whole different thing. If you want to look at the sale, then we can discuss that, and that's fine. I think there are discussions happening about that, and I think it's important that we discuss that. But, that is a different issue than restricting how they can own them, where they can carry them, or what parts can be on them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, 60% wanting the sale to be more strict, that's fine. If you aren't a criminal and you have nothing to hide, you would have no problem with the sale being a little more strict. Like if you want to do a more extensive background check, more follow-up, intervention, that's fine. People who are law-abiding citizens won't have a problem with that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that is true. The sale of firearms only affects non-criminals. It only affects people who should be able to own a firearm. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's important. Now, in 2017, 71% of people said that there should not be a law banning handguns. So that's 71% of the population. That's a large majority right there. Say that handguns should not be banned. And you hear a lot of people talking about the AR-15 or, the scary black rifle and all this other talk about assault weapons and all these other things. Handguns, I don't have this statistic in front of me here, but handguns are the majority of what's involved in any sort of, homicides or anything like that. So 71% of people feel that handguns should not be banned, despite the fact that they are more prevalent than any sort of rifle in any incident. 47% of people said that they would rather people better enforce the current firearm laws we have, with 2% of people saying they had no opinion, and 51% believe new laws should be passed. So with the 2% that have no opinion, we can kind of count them on the side of not wanting new laws. If they don't have an opinion, they're not actively pushing for more laws. So I think it's safe to say that 2% can be more on the side of people who aren't looking for new laws. So you're looking at roughly 49% of people who want to enforce the laws versus 51% who want new laws. That's split pretty darn even down the middle. So if anyone's saying that, a majority of people feel that we should have new laws passed and stuff, it's not necessarily true. That split is pretty even, and that's a large portion of the population to just discount. Now, here's a really important number that I saw when we were looking through this Gallup poll here. 56% of people surveyed do not own a firearm. So this isn't to be rude, but if 56% of people asked in this survey have not owned a firearm, how much experience can we realistically say they've accrued? How much knowledge do they have about firearms or the laws or how they work or how safe they are or how unsafe they are or how to use them?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the only way to truly understand a firearm and what goes into that process, buying one, owning one, using one, it's important to actually experience that before you can even say you have a strong opinion about it.
Yeah. And another stat we're going to throw at you here, 49% of people are against semi-automatic, quote, assault rifles. Now, as two individuals here, I would say we're relatively informed on firearms. You'll hear this word assault rifle thrown around a lot. And it's one of those things that just makes me cringe, because the word assault rifle, and I'll tell you this now, is a term that was sort of engineered by media platforms. It was a word that they started using that was thrown out into the public that sounds scary. It sounds dangerous, but it's not an accurate term. So this is coming from people who've done some research and we've had some experience here. The word assault rifle refers to a military firearm that has a select fire capability. So what that means is that select fire means you can switch the rate at which bullets are fired. So you can fire it once per trigger pull, and then at the flip of a switch, you can turn it to full auto, where you just hold the trigger and it goes. So select fire capability is what, for the most part, determines an assault rifle. It also includes medium caliber, other things like that. But it's a military term. It's used to describe military rifles. Military rifles are not legal for citizens to own. Some fully automatic firearms are legal for them to own, but they're not produced anymore. They were grandfathered in, and they're extremely, extremely expensive to own. So if you hear the word assault rifle and you start thinking people are walking around with fully automatic machine guns and all this other crap that people say, it's not true. It's just not true. They aren't made anymore. They're not fully automatic. Assault rifle is a scary term that's meant to kind of freak people out, and that's essentially it. And I mean, we got this definition of assault rifle from the NRA, which, okay, fine. You can say that might be a biased source, but it is true. From my knowledge, I know that's how you define an assault rifle. So we'll move on here. 42% of people say that new gun laws will not affect mass shootings at all. So we did reference that a little earlier. 42%. That's a pretty big number. They don't feel that any new gun laws would affect mass shootings. 56% of people feel that more concealed carry firearm owners would make the U.S. safer. And this is assuming that those people had a background check to own that firearm and a training course. So now the training course is something that's up for debate by a lot of people, but assuming those two factors, people felt that 56% of people felt that more concealed carry owners would make the U.S. a safer place to be. That's a significant number.
Yeah, and maybe I feel a little biased in this. My dad is a cop, so naturally I feel safer when he's around and he's carrying. You know, we go out to eat, we go to different cities where things can get a little sketchy and make me nervous, you know, being a small white American woman, you know, and I feel safer knowing that he is there to protect me if something were to happen. And that I completely agree with that statistic.
Yeah, and 63% of people say having a gun in the house makes it safer. So 63%. It's another pretty big number there. And, you know, those last two statistics that we cited are important because you got to remember, calling the police to come help you, there's response times with that stuff. So if you're being attacked in an alleyway, can you even call the cops? You know, I mean, that's the ability to even call for help, and then the fact that help takes some time to arrive. I mean, even the fastest police response times, things happen in an instant. And that's the reason so many people feel that owning a firearm is important, and they value it towards their safety because it gives you an instantaneous, heightened sense of your capabilities to defend yourself. It increases your, you could say, firepower. It automatically multiplies your force. So if you're up against a threat and you feel your life is in danger, that's a tool that's there with you right then. Not 7 minutes after you've called, not 10 minutes after you've called, not if you can even get to your phone to call. It's there.
Yeah, and not only would it make you safer if something were to happen, but it also decreases the chances of something happening. If someone sees you, they are, you know, they want to attack you, they want to mug you, and they see you're carrying, they're not going to approach you.
Yeah, and that one I will say is a little rough because if it's a concealed carry, they're not going to know if you're carrying. And open carry is kind of a different thing that only certain states, I believe, are allowing. But I mean, to your point, the idea of owning a firearm in the house. That's really, really important. I mean, the rate, we looked at a statistic, and I saw this. I don't have the exact numbers here, but what they call hot burglaries in the United Kingdom are much, much higher than the U.S. So what a hot burglary is a burglary that occurs when a resident is in the house or apartment or in the dwelling. So in the UK, criminals are much more likely to enter a home to either rob it or commit any other type of crime when there are people in the house. Whereas in the US, that number of hot burglaries is much lower because criminals know there's a very high chance that they're going to run into someone in the home with a firearm. So they'd much rather wait until you're not home to go in your house and steal something.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my house has these stickers on the windows of the doors that says protected by the Second Amendment. You know, not a security system, but protected by the Second Amendment. You know, when someone sees that, they think like, oh, you know, like maybe not.
Yeah, and then you're talking about it's not, you know, ADT having an alarm go off or anything like that. I mean, you know, I know some people have had their houses broken into even with the security system. And I mean, that's not to knock security systems. Please don't take it that way. But I mean, some criminals are bold enough to do that. But when they're considering whether they want to put their life on the line to steal from that home, I think a lot of criminals would rather just go to the next house down the block.
The next thing he says is that we're against background checks. But in all actuality, background checks are federally mandated. And the NRA says FFL licensed dealers are required by law to perform background checks. So while he may say that we're against it because it makes his point seem stronger, it's not actually true. The only people who don't go through that process are people who obtain their guns illegally. Now, the buying and the selling of a firearm, it's complicated. It's, you know, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a process to buying a weapon. But in general, people who make the occasional sale, exchange, or gifting of a firearm are not required to have a FFL, which is a federal firearms license, which gun shop owners need. So anyone who is selling a gun, like professionally at Cabela's, at Dick's Sporting Goods, they need to have an FFL, which means with that comes a background check. They are still required to know and abide by local, state, and federal laws. So regardless of whether or not they are abiding by the FFL, which they should be, they still need to abide by local, state, and federal laws, which are all set depending on the region you're in. I know that there are some different waiting periods when you order a gun between, like, you know, Jersey, California. The time period's different. The background check is a little different. But essentially, everyone needs to abide by that certain law. So when NQ says that we don't want background checks and that we don't have good background checks, that's not necessarily 100% accurate. You know, it makes his point stronger, yeah, and it's compelling, and it makes the poem really, really sparkle. But it's not accurate. You know, it's a skewed fact that he's saying, and it doesn't appeal to any sort of actual laws. You know, it's a little bit delusional to say that and to just completely neglect the fact that there are background checks.
Yeah, I don't know. This point kind of ticked me off because it's selectively choosing what you want to tell people. I mean, throwing the blanket statement out that we're against background checks, it's ridiculous. No, we're not. It's federally mandated that anyone who sells firearms as a retailer has to do a background check. It's so ridiculous that it just upsets me to say that we're against background checks. Now, of course, he's referring to private sales, but anyone who watches this doesn't know that. They hear that we're against background checks, and if they don't know any better, they think, oh, well, we need to start passing laws to get background checks set up. Well, little do they know we already have them instantiated. And the discussion about, you know, whether we need background checks on private sales, how are you going to enforce that? It just doesn't make any sense. How are you going to know when some random person in the U.S. decides to sell a firearm to somebody? You have no clue. And say they want to loan it to a family member who just had a break-in. I mean, how are you going to keep track of all of this? It's insane to think that we need to keep track of all of that stuff. And I'm fully aware. I'm fully aware that it is a potential issue, because I know not tracking where a firearm goes can get it in the hands of someone who shouldn't have it. But at the end of the day, then we need to start teaching people about the responsibility of owning a firearm and the impact that it can have. And people just need to be taught. I think it's more of a social issue rather than a legislative one. We need to inform people about responsible gun ownership and paying attention to where that gun ends up if you don't keep it. So, at the end of the day, I think those are my thoughts on it anyway. It's more of a social problem than a legislative problem.
Another thing he says is he tries to counter the mental health argument, saying it's illogical to think regulations wouldn't help, even if it's a mental health issue. We touched on this a little earlier about mental health and how it is a concerning issue and a big issue. And he's insulting opponents rather than arguing a point. I don't think throughout this entire thing he actually adds in a solution or an opinion that isn't based off of facts that he just found to use for his argument. I don't think that he actually has a solution in mind, to be completely honest. I don't know what regulations he wants. I don't know what this guy wants. He's just complaining, honestly. It almost seems like a little tantrum. It's not a factually based argument that offers up a solution.
Yeah,
and
I totally know what you mean. Lack of specificity.
Yeah, and we can talk about this till we're blue in the face, but until he offers a solution, it's just going to be irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, what is he talking about, you can't just say something's illogical and, to say that thinking regulations wouldn't help, and that's illogical to think that when you don't even tell people what it is they're disagreeing with. I mean, it seems he's just kind of throwing up enemies that aren't really existing because he hasn't said what people are countering except for the background checks, which is ridiculous, as we told you about. So, it's all just silly to say that it's illogical. We don't even know what he's arguing for, so how could we say if it's illogical or not? Just insulting people doesn't do anything, and he just keeps resorting to that tactic. But talk about being illogical here. Sort of the next thing he goes into, he starts bringing in airline security and how he thinks it's ridiculous that he can't do certain things because of airline security measures. And he tries to compare that to openly carrying a rifle. He says in Nevada specifically, which I think this video was released before the Las Vegas shooting. I'm not entirely sure. But he just goes off saying that certain things are ridiculous in the airline security, and he thinks it's ridiculous that we're allowed to carry rifles in Nevada or whatever he's referring to, because again, he's not very clear. This is a huge logical error that he makes, and to break it down in sort of a logician's terms, I guess, and I'm not very versed on this, but just because A might equal B, it doesn't mean C is also equal to B. Like, saying that something is something else, you have to prove that fact every time you compare something. So if you say airline security is ridiculous, prove to me it's ridiculous, which again he hasn't done. There might be a very good reason for sort of the seemingly crazy things that he's talking about, but just because you say airline security is ridiculous, that doesn't automatically make something else ridiculous. So I don't know how he just thinks it's okay to say that. I mean, he's kind of banking on the fact that whoever he's directing this video towards is automatically going to think that it's ridiculous that you're allowed to openly carry a rifle in Nevada. But we'll move on. So now we're going to play for you another clip. This is sort of him getting really deep into the emotional aspect of it. So have a listen to this, and then we'll come back and discuss that.
Can't you hear the children scream? Can't you hear the children scream? Can't you hear the children? Can't you hear them? Can't you hear them scream? You're on the wrong side of history. There is no in-between. When you look back in 20 years, tell me who you want to be. Can't you hear the children? Can't you hear them? Can't you hear them scream? It echoes through the halls of schools that were replaced by crime scenes. Can't you see the children? Can't you see them? Can't you see them bleed? Can't you see their parents seeing them in each and every dream? When the news vans have left and they're left with quiet streets and private grief, but they can't leave, they can't leave, they can't leave. So they count the seconds, minutes, hours, days, and nights and weeks, dealing with a pain so deep that it's awake inside of sleep. It's in their bones and in their smiles and in their hair and in their speech. And in the morning they remember tears streaming down their cheeks, chest heaving from the morning. It's impossible to breathe. And at that point, it doesn't matter what you once believed.
The first thing I want to discuss is when he says, "Can't you hear the children scream?" Again, this isn't the first time he's done this. This is the second time, I think, throughout this clip. He is attacking the character of the people who disagree, calling them unfeeling yet again. Thought he got mad when people accused him of wanting to confiscate firearms, but, now he's attacking the character of people who don't agree with him and in a terrible manner, bringing in children. He starts off with introducing Sandy Hook and the things that he bases his arguments off of. You can't call the other side of that unfeeling. You can't say that they lack sympathy because they want the right to bear arms. I don't think that's a fair argument. I think that's honestly cowardly. I think it's just because he's trying to reach for something to back up his argument and his claim, and to do that the best way he thinks is by attacking the character of other people.
Well, yeah, and that line, "Can't you hear the children scream?" He repeats it like 1,000,000 times. And I mean, I'll be honest, I disagree with this guy. But when I first watched this video and he just kept repeating that line, it upset me. Like it bothered me. So I can only imagine someone who might not have the same information we have or is coming from a different perspective on it. It's really powerful, but it's baseless. And that's what bothers me the most about this. He's manipulating a really powerful aspect that you can take advantage of with poetry, but he's ignoring the reality of the situation. And like you said, he's also insulting the people who disagree with him, just on no basis.
Exactly. You can make the most compelling argument that really touches people's emotions and really pulls on their heartstrings. But if it's not built off of anything, then it crumbles, and it's not a strong argument, and it does nothing for his cause.
Well, yeah. I mean, anyone can make an emotional argument over something. I mean, someone who steals something could sit there in front of you crying and say that person really needs it, and they're starving and they need this food and they had to take it because if they didn't, they would die. Does it make theft right? No. No, it doesn't. But again, that's the issue with emotional arguments. I mean, it's important to consider emotional impact. I get it. Like, it's not irrelevant, but you can't base arguments off of emotion. It leads nowhere. And I hate to sound robotic, but I mean, using logic and reason are what's required when you're trying to develop a solution to something. And a little bit later, he says, "You're on the wrong side of history. There is no in-between." Wow. I guess that sort of shows where he stands on this, not even a debate, apparently, to him. If you disagree with him, apparently you're on the wrong side of history. This just shows how unwilling he is to compromise on his position. And this brings us back to what we said before. We don't even know what his position is. And that's sort of one of the core issues I'll say about poetry. I like poetry. I write. Like, I'm a creative writer. I get it. Poetry's great. But I start to get edgy when it comes to, using poetry as a political device. Because one of the primary things that poetry's for is giving someone an emotional experience with your words. So, goes back to the logic and reason thing. If you're just going to use emotion, and that's all you're going to use to try and sway someone to your side, you're really doing the argument and doing the issue itself a disservice, because there are plenty of times when I'm sure people can relate when you've done something out of an emotional feeling in your gut or in your head, and later down the line you realize, wow, I screwed up. I should not have done that. I should have calmed down and taken some time to think that through.
Yeah, I mean, I do that all the time. I'm constantly acting out of emotions, and it's not until after I do something that's completely idiotic that I realize maybe I should have been a little more logical. So in actual issues that I'm dealing with, I do that, and I think that it's an important lesson for everyone to learn and an important quality for everyone to have.
Yeah, so I mean, just wish you'd be more specific. I get it's poetry, but, don't go making these claims then. If you say you're on the wrong side of history, well, we don't even know your side. So throwing down the possibility of discussion right away like that when you haven't even brought up a point, it's a little discouraging for anyone who is even willing to talk with you. But, oh well.
Yeah, and then there comes my favorite line. And at that point, it doesn't matter what you once believed. He completely dismisses any argument that goes against what he believes. He doesn't care about any other side except for his. And again, he's not being helpful. Okay, well, it doesn't matter what we believe, but what do you believe exactly? What do you want to happen? What are you asking for here? What are you trying to gain from this? And he just says, it doesn't matter what you once believed. Well, why not?
Yeah, and right before that line, he goes on this descriptive rant about what he thinks. Again, he's not one of these families, but he certainly feels he can describe their pain, even though he claims we can't feel their pain. He goes on this descriptive rant about how the families who had victims in a mass shooting, particularly I think he's referencing Sandy Hook, when their children were taken. And again, people who support the Second Amendment, none of us want these things to happen. We hate that these things happen. And we're not unfeeling. It's depressing to see that an incident like that occurs. But he goes on this rant saying how miserable someone's life is after they've lost their child in a mass shooting like that, which I'm sure it is. But he goes on this emotional rant, and then that's when he drops the line, "It doesn't matter what you once believed." So he's completely just throwing out anyone else's differing opinion that doesn't line up with his emotional response to the issue. Now, we've just discussed how it can be destructive to make decisions out of emotional responses. And he completely leads up to that when he dismisses everyone else's opinion. So that right there is the crux of the problem with this piece of poetry here. And it perfectly lays out exactly the issue that we have with this, and that he's just dismissing people and he's using emotion to base his stance. And it's just, it's destructive, it's inflammatory, and entirely unhelpful and misguided.
Well, on top of being misguided, he says, "Freeze." Now, I'm not sure what he's trying to do here. I'm really not. I don't know if he's bringing in the police or if he's talking about people who own guns in general. But if the police are being included as a problem, then why take away the Second Amendment? Why take away civilians' rights to bear arms? That doesn't make any sense. That's kind of countering the argument he's making. And to bring up police. Yeah, okay, there are issues going on right now with police brutality. And it is something that is very sad and tragic and shouldn't be disregarded. However, generalizing like that is exactly the issue I have with this video. He's not specific in any way, and he just makes this assumption that if he is talking about police, that they're reckless and trigger happy. And I think that in order to actually have a clear perspective on this issue, we need to stop generalizing. You know, one racist white man doesn't mean all racist or all white men are racist. That doesn't make any sense. You know, it's a huge generalization that hurts his argument.
Yeah, it's saddening to see this sort of complete disregard for your own argument. I mean, I find it kind of funny almost, because if he's referring to police in that final segment there, then if police are the problem and they're armed, then why would you not want citizens to be armed? That's kind of how you defend yourself. And not to go all, Second Amendment hardcore on you here, but it was meant as a defense from tyranny. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the entire government, but it could mean a tyrannical force, which, if he's going to argue that police are a tyrannical force, then wouldn't you want to be able to defend yourself in that instance? And I mean, tyrannical force can apply to anything. I mean, you could be getting mugged. That's a tyrannical force trying to overthrow your power. But, if he wasn't referencing police, because he could just be talking about gun owners controlling everything, which, again, he's not clear on any of this stuff. So we're just rolling with what we're given here. But if he's just talking about firearm owners, there's a stat from the U.S. Department of Justice, and these statistics show that the plurality of crimes committed with guns were done with illegally obtained firearms. So 39.2% of state inmates who possessed a firearm during their current offense obtained it illegally. So that's pretty much 40% of crimes are committed with people who obtain their firearms illegally. And I mean, throw it back to what we said before, the vast majority of crimes that are committed by gang members. So even if they didn't obtain their firearm illegally, a lot of crimes committed with firearms are done by people who have very little regard for the law, which is really crucial here. So if he's trying to imply that gun owners are the people that are being tyrannical and that are preventing any change from occurring, that's just not the case, because the majority of things that happen with firearms are done with or by people who have not much regard for the law at all, whether they got their firearm illegally or they're just involved in things that typically don't really have much respect for the law. Now, in 2014, there was an FBI report, and there's also a study for injury prevention that showed there's no correlation between gun ownership and homicide. So, we looked at this graph, and I'm sure you could find it on the internet. It shows that as, more people own firearms, the number of homicides just stays pretty much the same. There's no real increase. So, at the very least, you could say there's no correlation. But there are other arguments out there, and I'm sure there are statistics and things that are probably a little harder to find, but there are arguments out there that say more firearms actually make people safer. And you saw in that Gallup poll, people said that they felt more concealed carry permit holders and more guns in the household make things safer. So whether it's statistically proven or not, at least some people believe that. So we just need to remember that it isn't legal firearm owners that are the problem, because for the most part, they're responsible. They're taking on a responsibility. If they're a good firearm owner, they're responsible. That's just the sheer fact of the matter. So remember that it's criminals that are causing a lot of these problems that people like to reference. And it's also the mentally ill. As we've seen in a lot of mass shootings, a lot of these people are unstable. And, it just kind of points us in that direction of what really is the problem here. Is it firearms, or is it a crime problem and a mental health problem? And whether you want to argue that those make up the entirety of the issue, that's fine. You can have that discussion, but clearly this guy doesn't want to have that discussion, as we said before. And they're at least big enough issues that you can't completely disregard them.
So that brings us to the end of our first podcast. I hope that you guys enjoyed listening with us and being a part of this experience.
Yeah, this was definitely different than anything I've done before, but I'm glad we did it. And really, our aim with this is just to get you guys, you listeners here, some information. And I mean, we're trying to present to you guys a viewpoint that we feel might not be that popular or not many people have access to. So in the end, if at all we wanted to do was just present some facts, get you guys some information, put it in your hands. You can hear our arguments, but if you're not convinced, form your own. Please form your own. We're not trying to be dictators here. We just want to get you some information, and we want to explain things from our point of view, from people who, believe in the Second Amendment and feel that it's important. And, we have our stances on it, and we want to fill you in on those. So, if you listened, if you enjoyed, great. If you disagree, that's fine too. Please, if you disagree, form your opinions. And, hopefully you can use some of the facts we presented for you and form an argument. Because if you've got a better argument, the world needs it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're encouraging an independent mind. Do your own thing, form your own argument, and don't be afraid to speak your mind.
Yeah, that's sort of where this stemmed from. We wanted to get out there and put our independent opinions out there for you guys to hear. So thanks again for listening. This is Rhetorical Pixel, or Eric.
And Belong to the Bone, or Maddie.
Yeah, we're tuning out. So hope you enjoyed, and keep your ears open for another episode. Maybe we'll come back, do another discussion. Thanks.